1,000 of those men in England that do not work today.
What's he that wishes so? My cousin Westmoreland? No, my fair cousin. If we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss. And if to live the fewer men, the greater share of honor. God's will, I pray thee, wish not one man more. Rather proclaim it, Westmoreland, through my host, that he which hath no stomach to this feast, let him depart. His passport shall be drawn, and crowns for convoy put into his purse. We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us. This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when this day is named, and rouse him in the name of Crispian. He that shall live this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbors and say, tomorrow is St. Crispian. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's day. Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot. But he'll remember, with advantages, what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in his mouth as household words, Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so base. And gentlemen in England now amid shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, while Dennis speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day.
Yay! Welcome back for part 2 of Pathos Using Nostalgia. Though this be still part of our contemporary analysis series, we're going to look at least a couple of historical literary examples to maybe contextualize what was covered in part 1. So let's start with Shakespeare. I think a lot of Shakespeare's chronicle plays were quite political and were in part a sort of propaganda for the times. I think that Henry V, and this scene in particular, is very moving, but especially at the time of its performance, around the year 1600, it must have been quite nostalgic. Now, this play was the final part of his first tetralogy, also known as the First Henriad, which goes from Richard II to Henry V. But when we arrive at the Second Henriad, the optimism shown here in Henry V rather falls away as we get bogged down with complicated politics and so on. What was won by King Henry V in France is gradually lost by Henry VI, and the ensuing Wars of the Roses are laced with political complications and dilemmas. Now, with this Brexit situation, I explained in the previous video how a bit of national pride and a touch of nostalgia can go a very long way. I like a good rousing speech and have no problem with evoking a bit of nationalism from time to time. But here's the problem. Going back to that recent speech I mentioned by Anne Widdecombe, the new Brexit Party MEP who used to be a fairly high-profile politician for the Conservative Party a number of years ago. The problem I have there is that she and Farage and so on seem to think that they are making a speech on the behalf of the British people, as though the full strength of the electorate were fully behind them. But they're not. The truth is, in reality, it's about a third of the people who are or have registered to vote, and a lot of people don't even bother to register themselves or are obviously too young to do so. So these kinds of speeches, even if they were well spoken, well scripted and well founded in truth, they are not uniting the people, as, say, King Henry's speech would be, but they're dividing the people with every word. So, really, this is not the time for rhetoric. It's a time for truth and deliberation. This is where rhetoric is really dangerous. And as I said in video 1 in my short introduction, that in these contemporary analysis videos I will be taking a rather severe look at rhetoric. Now, getting back to Shakespeare, it is said that the so-called Middle Ages or medieval period really ended at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, and I'll go along with that too.
A horse! My kingdom for a horse!
Withdraw, my lord. I'll help you to a horse.
Slave, I have set my life upon a cast, and I will stand the hazard of the die. I think there be 6 Richmonds in the field. 5 have I slain today instead of him. A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!
Right, so anyway, Henry V, the actual king himself, definitely sits in a markedly different time period to Shakespeare, about 200 years difference almost. Now, we're talking about nostalgia, but time itself, people say, well, it's sort of time speeding up. Well, relatively speaking, it is, because I guess for Shakespeare, what was 200 years ago, yeah, that's quite a long time, but it wasn't necessarily that long ago. But if we say for us 200 years ago, now that's, you know, a huge amount of time. That really has an awful lot's changed, even just in the last 20, 30 years, never mind the last 200. So I think actually you could say that 200 years ago for Shakespeare is almost like saying 60, 70 years ago for us in terms of nostalgia. Anyway, now getting back to medieval England, another obviously very famous English author was Geoffrey Chaucer. Now, Chaucer's actually from this, not quite, he's certainly from this sort of rough period. He does actually cross over slightly with Henry V. He was quite old. Henry V was still a kid or something. But in terms of this first Henriad, Chaucer's around in this period. Right, but the nostalgia period for the contemporary of Chaucer, then, what would have been nostalgic for people in Chaucer's time? Well, that would have actually been the earlier medieval period, the sort of chivalric age. Now, a popular type of literature in Chaucer's time, well, had been for a while the Arthurian romance. Actually, on the continent, in mainland Europe, the romance in this sense was already a bit passé, but it was still popular in England in the courts. And Chaucer also uses these Arthurian romances, I think they're called miniature Arthurian romances, in his Canterbury Tales. He sort of mocks the genre a little bit too. This is quite evident through the miller, who sort of interrupts the natural order of the storytellers. He follows the Knight's Tale and rather sort of mocks the Knight's Tale with his fabliaux. And there are other miniature romances like The Wife of Barstow. Right, so Chaucer and Shakespeare both used nostalgia for various purposes. But what happens when, say, enough time has passed, when, say, there has been a clear shift from one age to the next, say, either politically, socially perhaps, religiously, philosophically, or even technologically? Well, what happens is usually a kind of mythology is born. So in Chaucer's time, people were interested in King Arthur and those separate stories of the knights and everything. But over time, a mythology had evolved from the histories of Geoffrey of Monmouth, then Wace, Layamon, and then also Chrétien de Troyes, all who kept adding bits to the stories. And then we end up with Sir Thomas Malory's slightly posthumous edition in that year again, 1485, thus proving the popularity of the Arthurian legends in this late medieval period, as that was actually one of the very first books to be printed by William Caxton in the whole of England. It's also interesting to discuss how much of Shakespeare's chronicles have shaped our common beliefs and ideas about history. I mean, did Cleopatra really go to see Caesar rolled up in a rug? Was Richard III really responsible for those killings, like the princes in the Tower and so on? Also, in Henry VI, he tones down the madness of the king quite a lot for political reasons. So even if historians later come along and say, well, actually it was almost certainly wasn't like that, it doesn't matter. Most people will never read those books or essays or watch and remember the documentaries, and the masses even today will mostly remember more mythological events of the past. The rhetoric basically of Shakespeare and many other writers will live longer in the memory of the public. So going back to World War II, I think we're beginning to see, or will at some point see, the start of this kind of mythology develop, where there was something good, if not great, about those times, but we don't really know what it was, and it isn't really recreatable anymore because the world is a completely different place now. Brexit isn't going to bring people together. At its core, the very idea of it is to divide us in more ways than one. What could bring us together is maybe fighting the catastrophic climate issue, for example. But one of the many sad realities of this ongoing Brexit debate is that as long as this goes on, and whether or not it happens in November or later, it's still going to go on for a very, very long time, and just further distracting us from far more important global affairs that really do need our attention. And that should be something that almost everyone can actually agree on and get behind. Well, that's all I have time for in this video, but actually there will be a third and final part to this video series on nostalgia. In the next video I will be dipping a little bit deeper into the mythology of nostalgia, and also looking at the future. Well, until next time, adieu.